Hello, welcome back to Comparative Anatomy. Let's examine the structures of the shark brain. We're using only the plastic model here. So you see this bulge here, this would be the olfactory bulb. And then it's connected to this region of the forebrain called the cerebral hemisphere. So it's not, the cerebral hemispheres of the fish brain is not as impressive as the cerebral hemispheres of the mammalian brain. The hemispheres of the mammalian brain are actually the most prominent portion, covering the other regions of the brain. Whereas in the fish brain, these are only the cerebral hemispheres, and you'll see the other structures exposed. Cerebral hemispheres, and this narrow region here would be the diencephalon of the forebrain. So diencephalon, cerebral hemisphere, olfactory bulb, connected to the cerebral hemisphere via an olfactory peduncle or stalk, or sometimes called as olfactory tract. And because the olfactory bulb is connected to the cerebral hemisphere via these two anterior lobes here, this region of the hemispheres would be called the olfactory lobes. So different from the olfactory bulb. And this region here would be the region of the midbrain called the corpora bigemina. So it's different from the corpora quadrigemina in mammals, because as you can see, there's only two lobes, corpora bigemina. And move more posteriorly, you'll reach the hindbrain. You'll have the cerebellum, which in shark is kind of like a partition into 4 quadrants. The cerebellum, this is also part of the cerebellum, called the auricle of the cerebellum. And this is the body of the cerebellum. And this hindmost portion of the brain is called the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata, which transitions into the spinal cord. So other structures from the dorsal aspect. This cavity or depression here in the medulla is the 4th ventricle. And this portion of the medulla, the rim of the medulla, is composed of somatic sensory tracts. So as I've said in the mammalian brain video, in general, the sensory fibers are located dorsally, and on the ventral aspect is the location of the motor fibers. So that green portion of the medulla on the floor of the 4th ventricle would correspond to the somatic motor columns, the somatic motor tracts. The dorsal rim of the medulla oblongata would be the somatic sensory tracts, somatic motor tracts at the floor of the 4th ventricle. Let's look at the olfactory bulb here. So the olfactory bulb is connected to this sac here that looks like a lip, but that's the olfactory sac containing those white fibers there called the olfactory nerves. That's actually cranial nerve 1. Those white stuff there. Olfactory nerves, olfactory sac, olfactory bulb. Let's look at the paper mache model here. So it looks like an eye, doesn't it? But don't be fooled, that's an olfactory bulb. That's an olfactory sac. And then inside the olfactory sac would be the olfactory nerves. Right. Ventral aspect of the brain, of the shark brain. So cerebral hemispheres pa rin, diencephalon, and this region would be the hypothalamus already, the floor of the diencephalon, the hypothalamus. So let's examine the structures here. There's always a bunch of structures located within the diencephalon. So this one represents the crossing or intersection of the two optic nerves. So this is the optic chiasma. And the optic chiasma goes dorsally to relay into the thalamus, as you've seen in the cat brain video. It's optic chiasma, optic nerves, optic tracts relaying visual information into the thalamus. So let's examine the hypothalamus. This entire structure here is actually the infundibulum. The infundibulum, which has two prominent lobes, the inferior lobes of the infundibulum. And this median structure here corresponds to the pituitary gland. And these two posterior lobes here would correspond to the vascular sac, which has an unclear, ambiguous function. As of today, it's still debatable kung ano ba talagang function. But the consensus is it looks like it has a sensory function. So in some way, it participates in collecting sensory information. So recent studies, for example, suggests that the vascular sac is responsible for integrating visual cues from the environment that can tell the fish of the seasons, so that it can time its reproductive functions according to the season. So it has a photoperiod, regulating photoperiod function, vascular sac. But if you consult older textbooks, they may suggest that the vascular sac also has a pressure sensing function, because it has hair cells, kind of like the hair cells that is pressure sensitive located in your ears. But regardless of the specific details, it looks like it has a sensory function. Right, so there's a vascular sac, or saccus vasculosus. And what else? That would be the cerebellum, the auricle to be specific, and this region would be the medulla oblongata, containing a bunch of nerves, the cranial nerves. I think it's now time that we run down the cranial nerves. So unlike in mammalian condition, the fish brain only has 10 cranial nerves, plus one weird cranial nerve whose function is also unclear. But let's run down the canonical cranial nerves 1 to 10. So the cranial nerve 11 and 12 doesn't exist in fishes actually. They exist, but not defined as cranial nerves. Because evolutionarily speaking, the cranial nerves 11 and 12 were once spinal nerves that just shifted their position into the skull and thus became the cranial nerves 11 and 12. But that's confusing you, I guess. So fish brain, cranial nerve 1 to 10 only, up to vagus nerve. So cranial nerve 1, as I said, olfactory nerves located in the olfactory sac. 2 would still be these optic nerves, sensory function. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, controlling the eyeball, so motor function. Cranial nerve 4, still dorsal ang position. Trochlear nerve, another motor nerve controlling the movement of the eyeball. Cranial nerve 6, abducens, another motor nerve controlling the eyeball. Lots of nerves innervating just your eyeballs, right? Cranial nerve 5, okay. So we look at the sides here. So here would be the location of 5, 7, 8, and 9. And they are usually in a tangled mess here It makes it difficult to distinguish which is which. But we have decided that this one is the trigeminus nerve. So the trigeminus, from the name, it has 3 branches, right? One going to the ophthalmic region, to the maxillary, and to the mandibular. And here would be the left portion. So this one is the trigeminus. This one is not another nerve, that's still trigeminus, and this is still a trigeminus. So you see the 3 branches, right? The ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. Trigeminus, trigeminus, trigeminus. Trigeminus, trigeminus, trigeminus missing here. And then wedged in between the huge trunks of the trigeminal nerve is the tiny facial nerve there, the motor nerve of the face, whereas the trigeminus nerve is the major sensory nerve of the face. And then this one here, already truncated here, would be the auditory nerve or vestibulocochlear nerve, carrying sensory information from the ears. And posterior to it is the glossopharyngeal nerve, mixed type of nerve, both sensory and motor. And then last, all on its own, the vagus nerve, the all-important nerve for lots of physiological processes. Vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 6, this is 5, 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10 cranial nerves. But I said there's a weird, like, black sheep among the cranial nerves of fishes. Studies suggest that they also exist in other vertebrates, including us. The extracranial nerve 0, also called as Nervus terminalis, whose function is not as clear as the others, right? But it looks like it has a role in controlling the development of the reproductive axis, the neuroendocrine reproductive axis, and also has a role in regulating the responses to certain pheromones. So Nervus terminalis. Cranial nerve 0. They named it cranial nerve 0, not a Roman numeral, because they did not want, anatomists did not want to, like, disrupt the original 1 to 10 numbering of the cranial nerves, so they just put it as cranial nerve 0.